Hello ladies and gents, I'm the Dapper Rat and welcome to the supercut of balancing properties. Now if you've seen part 1 through 5, you can skip this video as you won't be missing anything, as it's just the parts mixed together into one cohesive video. And with that being said, enjoy. Hello, I'm the editing rat, and I wanted to talk about something. I'm losing my voice a little bit because of the video that I'm working on. Usually they're more scripted, and I had a script for this one. God knows I had a script for this one, but for whatever reason I just couldn't read, like, at all. I make my script, which takes about a week because I'm doing all the research and everything like that, and then I usually read my script in a single day. I'll just get everything done and then I start editing it for the next week, and that's why I'm running on a bi-weekly schedule. However, when you can't read and it turns out that it's gonna take a few days to read your script and it took you 3 days to get through half of it and you're struggling and getting angry, I decided to just YOLO freelance it, and that made more work for me for editing me in the future. I'm really struggling for this. That's just to let you guys know that this is going to be less scripted than my other videos, and also there's going to be a lot more passion behind what I'm saying, so enjoy. Take this graph for example. On each corner we have anti-gankers, gankers, and team fighters. Using this, we could overlay properties to each section, as well as decide what properties are too important for duels to give to any one side. Once these properties are decided, they can then be categorized by oppressiveness in order to balance properly. Believe it or not, it's completely okay for a character to have every single property in the game. Hello ladies and gents, I'm the Dapper Rat, and today I'm going to refine one of my points from a previous video. As I said in that clip, my idea was that we could overlay properties onto different sectors and then change heroes accordingly. However, I never said exactly where each property would go, thus the birth of this video. So today I'm going to go through each property in the game, put them on a tier list, and offer potential balance changes at the end. However, before we get into that, I want to go over some definitions to clarify exactly what we're talking about. If you already know the terminology, then great, skip through, I'll put a timestamp or something. If you don't, well, sit back and enjoy, I guess. So first we have a duel, which is pretty simple, just a 1v1 between two opponents, and then next is a team fight, which is either a 2v2, 3v3, or 4v4. Then, for lesser known ones, we have ganking. That is when you and your teammates are all ganging up on a single opponent, and anti-ganking is when you are getting ganged up by multiple opponents. This can be a 2v1 or a 3v1 or a 4v1. There's also something else I'm going to go through, which is called revenge, that I mention quite often throughout this video. Revenge is an addition to the game to help people that are in ganks to fight off multiple opponents. And so what that usually entails is that when you get revenge, you gain uninterruptible stance, which we go through later. It gives you a full health of shield. It also gives you the ability to knock down opponents, something else that we also go through, using your guard break throws. Properties are basically additions added onto an attack, or like kind of an effect added onto an attack or a move that enhances it in a certain way that makes it a little bit better. And we go through what each one does as well. So let's get started alphabetically with Allard. So Allard is a counter-attacking property, giving the hero a guaranteed hit on successful use. The way it does this is that you guard all 3 of your positions, however you can't guard break. So contrary to first impressions, it is strongest in a gank. Oftentimes, using an Allard, you will just stand in close proximity to whoever it is you are ganking, so that if they attack your teammate, by proximity they attack you, and by attacking you, you then get a guaranteed hit on them. Now, in a team fight, it's less viable, but it can be used. Also, in a duel, Allard is exclusively used to punish a careless counter. Now, when it comes to using it in an anti-gank, you would think that it would shine best as it protects all 3 angles, although it leaves you completely vulnerable to bashes, unblockables, guard breaks, and traps, making it a really poor defensive option. This earns Allard a spot into ganking. Next, we're going to move on to bashes. Bashes are a displacement attack that guarantees a specified follow-up. They cannot be blocked or parried, only dodged, and take relatively long to completely execute, but not long at all to benefit from. Now, there are weaknesses. After dodging a bash, they do have the weakness of being guard break or parry vulnerable, and with this information, bashes are comfortably abusable in team settings as their weakness can no longer be exploited. Now, when it comes to an anti-gank, the bash begins to fall short. It's only very useful in specific kits where you can occupy multiple opponents at the same time, or when it's stacked with other properties. Now, where I'm struggling to put it is because of this. In duels, bashes are extremely oppressive force, and they can generally be countered by someone who is calm and attentive, provided that the bash is reactable to some degree, which creates a little bit of a problem. The bash is definitely good in duels, but it's also good in ganks. And the reason that creates a problem is that it's not good enough in ganks to just put it in ganks, and it's not good enough in duels to just put it in duels without your duel character kinda pseudo becoming a gank character. So I would recommend either increasing the amount of revenge meter a bash gives or greatly decreasing it. Moving on, we have bleed. Everybody seems to hate bleed. It does non-permanent damage to an opponent, causing their health to tick away slowly, and getting healed by any amount from any source will immediately remove all bleed from your hero. So this allows bleed-based moves to dish out more damage than what is usually allowed. That being said, in a gank, bleed is great, and there is a reason for that. Your attacks don't do as much damage, so they feed less revenge. However, you're forgetting that extra bleed on top of it, which means that you're doing more damage for less revenge. And then there's the added bonus on top of that, where if somehow the person you're fighting gets revenge anyways, you can still attack their health bar because bleeding ignores the shield that they get. Moving on to team fights, you are doing, generally speaking, more damage than a regular team, but at the same time it's not a huge deal, and if they just keep their composure, it's not really gonna affect them all that much. Moving on to duels, basically the same thing. Your time to kill might actually be a little bit lower than a base character, because if your bleed was flat damage, you might be able to kill people way faster. However, in an anti-gank, that hurts tremendously. Stacking bleed on people in an anti-gank is horrific because that damage is not confirmed, which means you're going to be in that anti-gank for way longer than you would like to be, which means you're way more often going to die in an anti-gank because you can't kill people fast enough. This earns bleed a spot in the gankers category. It doesn't make sense anywhere else because its only real benefit comes from ganking. Now then, moving on to counters, a property completely unique to Black Prior, and thank God it is, because this property bothers me. So what counters do is it is essentially a catch-all move. With this property, doesn't matter if they have hyper armor, doesn't matter if it's unblockable, doesn't matter if it's a bash, they can counter you, and it works like Allard in a similar way, where they counter you and they get a confirmed hit off of it. Now then, the other additive benefit of this is if multiple people are attacking you and they hit you within a certain window of using it, you just restart the animation and counter them as well anyways. Now, it does have a single weakness, just one, and that weakness is guard breaks. This basically means that your counter is a stronger version as Allard, because it has the same benefits with none of the weaknesses, which basically means you can stick near the person, get a guaranteed hit off, and it doesn't matter what they're using to attack your teammate. Under perfect conditions, it's basically impossible to win a gank against this guy. In a team fight, it's still very, very strong because, as I explained before, or as you failed to explain because you went on another rant for no reason, in a team fight, essentially, neither one of your opponents can really attack you, because if you counter them, then they can't stop any of the damage. Only your teammate can interrupt you, so a patient teammate will be able to capitalize on your counter, and even if you end up getting guard broken, your teammate is still there to bail you out by just interrupting the enemy and letting you recover, so there's really no risk involved even in a team fight. Because of this puts counters as the only central property. Continuing, next is Deflex, which are high risk, low reward move that is extremely flashy and feels amazing to do. Basically, just dodging into an opponent's regular attack initiates your deflect, allowing you to hit them and gain offensive control, just as a parry would. Now in a gank, deflects have no use, because if your opponent is not locked onto you, you can't use it, and if they are locked onto you, it has a tiny bit of use as it does stun your opponent for a small amount of time, but this window is so small that it's just negligent. In team fights, deflects are actually kind of at their best because you can easily hit deflect after deflect if your opponents aren't careful. Now moving into a duel, deflect loses its viability, just becoming an alternative to a parry. However, the hit of dopamine alone from landing a deflect, I think makes it viable enough for me. Overall, there isn't really a downside to using a deflect in a duel, and there's not really an upside either. Now in an anti-gank, it is actively a detriment because it works as a parry without the extra defense from chain parries. So I'm currently editing this, and I wanted to double check if this was actually true, because I remember chain deflects kind of being a thing. So after testing over and over again, I found out that yes, they are a thing. However, their window is smaller than chaining parries together. They're much less reliable, and so just overall they are a worse version of the parry. However, you can chain deflects together as is right now. Monitoring these, we can see that deflect has its home in team fights. However, due to the deflect's low impact, even in team fights, it's completely okay to put it as a duelist property. Moving on, we have enhanced lights, a property that stops your attacks from being fully blocked, stopping your damage as usual but not interrupting your chain. Enhanced lights roughly have the same viability in all categories, as being able to fight using your light attacks with less of a disadvantage is huge. Enhanced lights apply a non-threatening pressure where it is up to the victim to decide how dangerous it is. Essentially, when being attacked by someone with an enhanced light, the light itself is not the threat, but the chain that comes after it is. So each individual has to decide their personal ability to deal with a hero's chain. So overall, this is gonna land in the duelist category. I'm fine with everybody having this. Next is knocked down. As the name implies, it knocks you to the floor. It is extremely powerful for ganks, as leaving your opponent completely helpless like a little child is extraordinarily strong. In the case of a team fight, its strength falters a bit because your opponent's teammate can defend him while he's out cold, but is usually viable enough to use successfully, and so it's not that big of a deal. Moving to duels, knockdown basically is a non-factor. It's still completely viable, especially because oftentimes you are given a guaranteed attack after this. Now in anti-ganks, it really depends. For some heroes, it can be viable for displacement or even just taking someone out of the fight for a little, or for actual use to do damage. Now that being said, its usefulness in an anti-gank is heavily reliant on other factors like the distance and the stacked properties, or even the hitbox range. Everybody remembers old Valkyrie's sweep. It doesn't matter if you're a teammate or foe, you are all sitting your ass on the ground. This nets knocked down into the ganker category. Next up, uninterruptible stance, or better known in the community as hyper armor. It is a property built around trading attacks. Essentially, if you are attacked, you won't be interrupted unless your enemy uses a bash. Now in ganks, hyper armor has very little use. You can use it to counter externals, but chances like that are few and far between unless you're a specific character. And in a team fight, you excel very well because not only can your opponents no longer interrupt you, but your teammate can't interrupt you either. Now within a duel, a tiny bit more brain power needs to be used, as determining whether your hyper armor is going to be useful or a detriment, as it is a double-edged sword. In an anti-gank, it once again depends. While not being interrupted is very strong in an anti-gank, it can also be a detriment against super aggressive groups, since they will just out DPS you. Overall, this puts hyper armor in the team fighter category. Next up, we have pins. Pins are a move that occupies both hero and opponent in an animation for an extended period of time. Pins are notorious for their strength in ganks, as keeping an opponent vulnerable for an extended period of time is a huge advantage. Now, when using it in a team fight, we enter more of a gray area, as the pin becomes a double-edged sword. you're both locked in animation, and thus both are vulnerable to getting hit by either person's teammate. Now in a duel, pins are a non-factor. They have no added benefit whatsoever, but there is no disadvantage at all. In an anti-gank, pins are actively a detriment, as keeping yourself still and defenseless like a child in a ring of enemies is asking for, well, expiration, meaning pins earns its spot in ganking. Next up, we have recovery cancels. Recovery cancels allow you to cancel the recovery of certain moves, immediately letting you perform a specified one. Recovery cancels often come in a defensive variety, but still see great use in offense. In a gank, recovery cancels mean very little, as a defensive opponent won't make the mistake of falling for your recovery, and an offensive opponent still gains the benefit from externaling your teammate. Now in a team fight, your recovery cancels become very versatile, shifting the dynamic of a 2v2 into a 2v1 and a 1v1, with both your fights in your favor. Now when you look into a duel, you also greatly benefit from recovery cancels, but often need a tiny bit more brain power, as a patient opponent can counter you easily. Finally, in an anti-gank, you shine brightest, as canceling recoveries often means that while on the offense, you still have the defensive option, usually splitting a gank, no matter how many people there are, into multiple back-to-back 1v1s. This puts recovery cancels into the anti-ganker category and should be used very carefully. Next up, we have soft feints. I love soft feints, a widespread property which is used sparingly in For Honor. Soft feints let you cancel your current attack into a different attack. Now in ganks, soft feints are a hit or a miss. Their usefulness is often hinging on a stacking of properties. This basically means that on its own, soft feints are not great in a gank. In a team fight, you see more use, as you can often attack both opponents without letting up pressure on either one. However, this only works for target swappable attacks. Now in duels, soft feints show their true colors, forcing your opponent on their heels just to keep up with you, as well as giving you mind game advantage. It is huge. Now in anti-ganks, you can gain the same benefit as a team fight, with your opponents never truly knowing who you're going to attack, although its impact in an anti-gank is target swap reliant and susceptible to highly aggressive gankers, landing it in the duelist zone. One sandwich later and we are on pushback or stagger. It's a highly powerful, low impact property that, as the name implies, displaces your opponent by staggering them. This property has the ability to wall splat and can be exceptionally dangerous. However, it's used sparingly throughout For Honor, and without added properties, it is kind of a non-threat. In ganks, stagger can be very powerful, essentially extending how long you're vulnerable after being hit. In a team fight, its strength also shines, as it has the dual purpose of confirming extra damage or stalling for a quick 2v1. In duels, stagger is still powerful, since at best you can gain free damage and at worst you go back to neutral, and stagger in of itself has no downsides, and this continues to be true in an anti-gank, as occupying an opponent in an animation is a great help when dealing with multiple people. Overall, this marks stagger as a duelist property and brings. Now moving on to superior block, a simple property that lets you block during an action, whether that be dodging or attacking, and often confirms damage, but not always. While in ganks, superior block has little effect, however it can be used to counter an external. In team fights, superior block becomes quite strong, as punishing your opponent's offense by using it against them is not only great, but has a very low risk of hitting your own teammate. In a duel, superior block can be extremely oppressive, and now it's not completely unbeatable, but it gives heroes a really safe way to counter most attacks. In an anti-gank, superior block shines rather well, as a defensive move that doubles as offensive is completely in line for an anti-ganker, landing superior block into the anti-ganker category. Next up is traps. Unique to Nucia, traps are grossly unused in For Honor. This property punishes a character for blocking or parrying an attack. This is beautifully mischievous move, as it messes with a person's basic instinct of the game. In ganks, the property can reign supreme if it was more consistent. The range of traps are terrible and feed revenge even if they didn't connect. When not bugging, traps will destroy your opponent in a gank, and in a team fight, traps have little to no use as most defense in a team fight is dodge reliant, which means you can't really use your traps. Moving into a duel, traps once again rise to the top, becoming a terrifying property to go against, causing people to second guess themselves. In an anti-gank, you can see a little use, however, like many properties, it does not fare well against very aggressive opponents. This lands traps in the ganker category, but due to its instability and low impact, I could see it being a duelist property no problem. Moving on to Unblockables. It's one of the most popular properties that forces your opponent to parry or dodge your attack. In gank, this property is very strong as it forces your opponent to take a 50-50 chance on whether or not they're going to get hurt for a lot of damage. In a team fight, Unblockables work the same as well as in duels and in ganks. I mean, it's a 50-50 chance you either get hit or you don't. Universally, this property's strength comes from how it's used to mess with your opponent. I mean, you force them to make a read. However, it's also very powerful in every situation, kind of like counters, but it does have more counterplay than counters does. So I'm gonna place Unblockables in the duelist property, and what this will do is it will likely give every person a benefit to ganking compared to anti-ganking, and that's because Unblockables are more powerful when you're ganking someone than if you're anti-ganking, although they're not terrible while anti-ganking. And so I feel like this might be just something that we have to deal with. Most of the other universal properties are relatively even across the board. This is the one where I just had to bite the bullet because I don't see Unblockables being in any other category without making a duel hell between players. Putting in the ganker sector essentially makes everybody that is not a ganker kind of an inferior duelist compared to them. That being said, we're moving on to Undodgeables. As the name implies, this property stops you from being able to dodge an attack. In a gank, this can see some use, but generally is useless as most opponents will opt for a block or even parry you. Although, select heroes are more keen on dodging, so you can get some use there. In a team fight, you can see more use since, as stated before, dodging is a big part of team fights. Stopping the voluntary displacement of an enemy in a team fight is very strong. In a duel, this property only gains strength when your opponent is threatened by something else like a bash, which is notorious in the game, is getting annoying, but that's because it's oversaturated. Just every character is bash, undodgeable, or is unblockable, undodgeable, or some sort of mix-up where you either have to dodge or you have to parry. This lands Undodgeables into the teamfight category. Finally, we have variable timing. This property lets you change the timing of your attack up to a certain maximum. In ganks, this has a tiny bit of use as messing with an opponent's perception can help. Moving to teamfights, you can see an unusual use as you are able to target swap multiple times, keeping your opponents on edge. Get your mind out of the gutter. In a duel, this becomes much stronger as parries become less reliable, especially after learning general parry timings. In an anti-gank, you gain the same benefit as a team fight, but often putting opponents on edge and stopping them from attempting to attack you in case they need to defend. However, in larger groups, this property becomes weaker as you can't threaten everyone at the same time. This grants variable timing a spot in the duelist category. Since we're actually done with our placement, we can move on to balancing, how often it's used. In this final part, we are going to go over one last property, then balance the overtuned, underpowered, or awkwardly positioned ones. That being said, we have Stun, a property that temporarily dazes your opponent. During this daze, your POV shakes a bit and your guard UI is hidden from you. Stun used to be a monster in its former days, but has been nerfed and removed from a lot of the heroes. In ganks, Stun can serve a pretty good amount of use as it forces your opponent to focus on multiple characters' animations instead of just their guards. This makes it slightly harder to defend, but as you get better at the game, the guard UI tends to help less as muscle memory begins to kick in. In a team fight, your use case is about the same, just a little less effective as your opponent can be partially defended by their teammate. Moving to a duel, Stun used to be a powerhouse, but now is quite laughable. In the early game, you could see some use as reliance on UI is at its maximum, but in higher ranks of play, the daze status effect does absolutely nothing in a duel. Finally, in an anti-gank, stun is completely useless. I've tried thinking of a single scenario where having even one of your opponent's daze could be beneficial, but I got nothing. The effect doesn't last long enough to capitalize on, and even then, a dazed opponent could quite easily dodge roll into the safety of their teammates. Overall, this lands stun in the ganker category, and with that out of the way, we can get into balance. Starting off with bashes, we can see an overall score of 6.75 out of 10. I wouldn't call this grade problematic, so why rebalance it? Well, as I said in my video covering bashes, we have a problem of being able to commit to its placement. Again, I don't really care where it goes, but a change has to be made. Either increase the revenge gain from getting bashed to make it completely unusable as a ganking tool. Then we can place bashes in the duelist category. Or greatly reduce the revenge gain from getting bashed and strictly make it a ganker's property. Not only do I find this change simple, but pretty coherent. And of course, gank-based heroes can use their bash in their moveset for duels, but someone like a teamfight based hero wouldn't. Moving on to the most problematic child, we have counters with an overall score of 9.25 out of 10, almost maxing out every category. The changes I'd make to counter are quite simple. I'd remove its ability to counter externals. Just to not completely shit on the property, it will still give you iframes from externals to ensure you won't get hit. However, you will not gain the benefit of stopping the enemy and damaging them. This will castrate counter's ability to be used in a gank, removing a large amount of frustration. This also means that counter will no longer be a better version of Allard, as Allard would still be usable in a gank as is. This change also weakens its might in teamfights without making it completely useless. I believe an external that hits an already started counter should work as is now, although if that's too hard to code, just giving the counter a stacked property of hyper armor will suffice. Next up, we have Deflex with a score of 4.75. My ranking of Deflex stirred up the most controversy as a deflect changes based on the assassin. Some deflects are better in an anti-gank, others as a ganking tool, with some being easy to hit that they are demons in a teamfight. My change to the deflect means that all these would have to at least partially change or be accommodated to accordingly. My goal was to improve the viability of a deflect without giving up its unforgiving nature/feeling. And so I recommend that when getting a chain deflect, the strength of the deflect multiplies. The exact numbers would obviously have to be tested, but seeing a change of 2 times for the first change, then reducing for each consecutive chained deflect would boost its lethality in a anti-gank, but leave other aspects untouched. This change would semi-throw balance into chaos, with some heroes already having high damaging deflects and others technically not having a damaging deflect at all. This means that those with higher damage deflects would need their damage reduced, or the better option would be changing their multipliers to be less effective. For example, a deflect that does 18 damage could get a modify that goes by 2 times, then 1.5, 1.25, then 1.1 after that. Whereas a deflect that does 24 can start its modifier at 1.7, then 1.3, then 1.1 after that. The stacking damage will only work if you chain deflect an enemy, so your teammates cannot artificially boost you. As for Berserker, the only assassin without a true deflect, it's as simple as a change in button input. I think the animation is fine, just have it do 18 damage and work as the first heavy of his chain. Following deflects, we have traps. Traps are in a similar position as bashes. First of all, they need to be more reliable no matter the change. Whiffing a trapped attack when a regular attack would have hit makes me violent and lash out at my loved ones. It's infuriating beyond belief, and if it wasn't for the fact that no one plays Nucia, it would have been changed already. That being said, just like a bash, traps either need the revenge transfer heightened or lowered to make it either a duelist or ganker's property. Personally, I would opt with having it heightened, because I want as little reason as possible for the devs to not use this absolute monster of a property god, I love it so much. Finally, we have stun, a property that, if I remember correctly, has been getting gutted for years. Starting off as essentially a flashbang, it has been reduced down to a minor inconvenience even for low mid-tier players, and has been removed from almost all characters, of which the pool of characters who had it was already small. I actually quite like stun as it adds a level of immersion into the game. Having your head kneed into a wall is definitely something that would at least daze you. At least it used to until they took it off Raider. My changes would be to either increase the flashbang effect to its former glory. I want white blotches all over my screen every time I get kneed, KO'd, or hit by an attack that honestly should cave in my head. However, I understand that this property was hated for a reason, so my less fun and immersive idea would be to extend the duration. As it stands right now, with how weak being dazed really is, the duration should be way longer. Really, I can't get over how unimpactful this property is. Like, if you were some freak and played without guard UI, I wouldn't be surprised if you thought this property literally didn't exist. That being said, it's all I have for today, and now more than ever, I would like everyone to leave feedback. Let this video become a melting pot of changes you'd like to see in For Honor. Pretty soon I plan on doing a video responding to comments, and so that being said, thank you for watching and farewell, ladies and gents.